everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Susanna Valenzuela, and I am the president of the Railway Museum Board of Directors. And we want to thank y'all for being here this afternoon. We're really excited about this new speaker series that we're starting. I came on the board back in about 2019, and we had just renewed our lease with the city, and we have made great strides since that time with events. We have 4 events this year. So please follow us on Facebook to get more information about those so you can come out and see those events as well. There's a lot of effort put into them, and we're really just enjoying this wonderful history that we have here in San Angelo. And we are very excited that we finally get to focus on that. We've been working really hard just to make sure that this museum stays open, and now we get to actually focus on the history of this museum, this depot, because it does have a great history here in San Angelo. So I just wanted to introduce myself, say hello, say thank you for being here. If there's anything I can do, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm going to introduce to you Rocio Monsiváis. She's our secretary, treasurer.
Don't stand in front of that light. You will go blind. Like she said, my name is Rocio Monsiváis, and I'm the treasurer here in the Railway Museum. We are very excited to be putting on this program for you all. We are a small museum, but we do have big plans and big dreams to expand our reach here in the community, and so that's why we're doing programs like this. In conjunction to this program, we are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the museum, and so you will see some of us wearing a pin, and that is one way that you guys can help support us. It's $25, and it's in the gift shop, and it's a memorable thing that you can keep forever. We also have we have membership opportunities as well as sponsorship opportunities. If you guys are interested in those, you can talk to any of us and we will give you more information. And also we will be participating in San Angelo Gives, which is May 3rd. So if you are planning on supporting any nonprofit organization, we ask that you also consider supporting us. Like I said, we are trying to do bigger and better things here, and we're very excited to be able to offer this program. Michael Powers is our speaker this evening, and I'm going to read you guys a short little bio. Dr. Powers earned his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Florida in 2010. He went on to earn his Master's for Clemson University in 2012 and a PhD from the University of Arkansas in 2018. He did a lot of schooling back to back. Dr. Powers is an assistant professor in history at Angelo State University, where he has taught since 2019. In addition to intro-level history classes, Dr. Powers also teaches the history of Texas, the U.S. Civil War, U.S. Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. So his talk today is titled Knights and Barons, the Great Southwest Railroad Strike of 1886. We hope that you enjoy it, and we'll turn the time over to Dr. Powers.
Thank you. If I can, I'm going to use my professor voice to project, but the clicker and my notes would be a little bit much to have that microphone, I think. But thank you so much for that warm introduction. It is a thrill and an honor to be here this evening as the first of what hopes to be many speaker series here at our Railway Museum. So, as Rocio mentioned, my title is Knights and Barons, the Great Southwest Railroad Strike of 1886. I'm going to be talking about a period of American history that isn't normally thought of as far as in the forefront maybe of the American past. We might think about, say, World War II or the Revolutionary War or the Civil War. But what happened in those decades after the Civil War? Really the growth of what we recognize today as modern America. And railroads are so central and are the driving engine, pun intended, of making the United States a modern country. So we're going to examine the first nationwide labor union in U.S. history called the Knights of Labor, where we get the Knights from. And we'll also look at one of the more prominent big businessmen of the time period, otherwise known as a robber baron as they were called, so where we get the baron in that title. So speaking of that, when we think about maybe the Gilded Age and some robber barons, we'll do a little bit of participation if we would. What maybe individuals come to mind when we think of these titans of industry or robber barons of the late 19th century?
Rockefeller.
Yeah, Rockefeller. He's normally straight up, right way. Who else?
J.P. Morgan.
Yeah, J.P. about a leader, particularly a leader in the railroad industry and a financier by the name of Jay Gould. He wasn't as much of a household name in today's time, but he was a very formative figure in the late 19th century. So to set up a conflict that begins in Texas, and at that time would be the biggest labor union strike in U.S. history when it erupts in 1886, we got to set up what is developing in the United States. First would be the growth of the iron horse following the Civil War. And here in Texas, as elsewhere in the South, really was the center of a railroad bonanza. The last 2+ decades of the 19th century, the South built railroads faster than the rest of the nation. In the 1870s and 1880s, and we're keying in on 1886, in those decades, 40,000 new miles of railroad track were laid in the United States, and much of that in the former Confederacy. And between 1880 and 1890, just in that decade, the number of railroad track in the South more than doubled. By 1890, 9 out of every 10 Southerners lived in a county with a railroad hub. Tom County would be among those. We get the railroad here in 1888, a couple of years after this. And by 1890, here in Texas, every Texas city with at least 4,000 people had a railroad connection. So we've got significant railroad growth. Well, how does that happen? One significant factor of that is the very nature of railroads. Have y'all ever heard of a mom and pop railroad? Maybe just a small railroad? It, by definition, is big business. It's a big corporation. It takes a lot of capital. So to spur railroad growth, the Gilded Age after the Civil War really wasn't, when we look at railroads, it wasn't a reflection of a free market, laissez-faire capitalism. Instead, government sponsorship, the state governments, often in Texas and elsewhere, but also the federal government, were central to railroad development. So through loans and subsidies, right-of-way privileges, land grants, about 129 million acres were given by various government agencies to railroad companies. In Texas alone, 32 million acres of land were granted to railroad companies, spurring about 10,000 miles of track. So what we're going to be looking at here then is when we see railroad workers begin to agitate and want better pay and benefits, what they're saying is not that they want the government to get involved in society and the economy. Instead, they say it already is. It's aiding big business and these railroad barons like Jay Gould, where it's not, in their view, aiding ordinary Americans. So it's not an issue of should government get involved with more regulations or increase the standard of living of workers. Government's already there, it's just aiding out many of these big businessmen. Well, the railroad also fosters expansion of Western settlements. When we think about the frontier, so to speak, expanding, we might think of covered wagons and Little House on the Prairie. But in reality, settlements followed railroads. Railroads came first. And a lot of farmers would buy land from railroads. They owned a lot of the lands around that track. So pretty common for an aspiring family to settle a new area, recently conquered from Native Americans or something, where you go on that railroad line to the terminus, to the end point, and from there, maybe buy your wagon and go the last 50 miles or so. Well, by the few decades after the Civil War, railroads would become an example of what many Americans were beginning to try to grapple with. And that is really large businesses, really huge corporations that had begun, according to many Americans, to be monopolies. So a monopoly is not just a big business, but a business that is able to dominate a certain region of the country, and particularly in a certain industry. So a monopoly is when a business gets so large, they really can throw their weight around. They determine what prices are for using their services, how much they charge for freight and passage on the railroad. And since they're a monopoly, they can have a pretty heavy say in those labor conditions as well. Well, no industry was more of a symbol of America than railroads. By the late 19th century, the U.S. would have more railroads than Britain and Germany combined. So the United States is at the vanguard technological development to happen in the 19th century. So railroads are a symbol of America, and railroads would come to symbolize both the hope of progress and change, but also the anxieties of that industrial change. It almost would be like if it was physically possible for us to see, hear, and touch the internet, and how much change the internet has brought to American lives in the decades. Railroads did the same thing. So by the 1880s, the period we're looking at, railroads are no longer mere businesses. They had become economic titans that often totally dominated their operating areas. If to this day, if someone wrongs you, a phrase we might heard is, you got railroaded, right? That's often by the railroad company, taking away some of that fair play. Well, railroads are so powerful, by 1883, it is railroad leaders who standardized time. So when we're talking about controlling time, that's power. So it was railroad officials, not political leaders, who carved out our modern time zones of Eastern Time, Western Time, Central Time. Railroads are also the largest single employer in the U.S. at that time. And whoever the largest single employer in the U.S. is in a given moment tells us a lot about the state of the country, kind of how that country and economy functions. Any guesses today, who's the single largest employer in the United States?
Walmart.
Walmart, yeah, Walmart. So that tells us about kind of the state of the U.S. economy. We're kind of a post-industrial country, not as much jobs in industry anymore. It's a retail business. We can see the importance then of consumerism. Well, in the late 19th century, railroad companies were those single largest employers, particularly the Pennsylvania Railroad. So that meant that many Americans are grappling with, what if businesses get so large that they're not operating in the public good, even though they are a public necessity? So that's something that we'll be grappling with in this talk as well. And leave it to Henry David Thoreau to give us a nice catchy quote about this. Thoreau, of course, as always, like a lot of us today, had anxieties about modernity, that didn't mean we were getting isolated from ourselves. Henry David Thoreau, who was constantly irritated that he could hear passing trains from his refuge on Walden Pond, said, quote, "We do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us." So railroads definitely bring a lot of progress, but in that change there's some anxiety and there's some dislocations as well. Well, there's two issues that many Americans see with railroads by the mid-1880s. One is that where railroads function as a monopoly, meaning there's only one railroad in town, that railroad could set whatever rates they wanted. So in an area where railroads were a monopoly, railroads could border on extortion of farmers. You had to ship your cotton, your corn through the railroad. You had no other choice. By the mid-1880s, American pressure from the public got the government to investigate railroads that had benefited from government aid, and a government report in 1885 said that officials for the Union Pacific, I think they speak for particularly Jay Gould, as we'll see, set rates, quote, "a prominent principle that corporate extortion is a performance in which railroad management may indefinitely indulge with impunity." So railroads could charge really high rates for individual farmers, yet give discounts and rebates and free passes to their cronies and political allies. Well, in areas, particularly around Dallas or Houston or Chicago, most notably, in areas where there were many different railroads vying for passengers and for freight, basically in areas where railroads were not a monopoly, competition made their rates go down, which is good for consumers, but a big way to cut costs and try to raise profits in any business, particularly in the 19th century, was to cut labor costs. So where there was a lot of competition for railroads, pay cuts were all too common. So this would lead one leader, several years after our talk in the 1890s, to say the question, quote, "the question might be asked how the railroad companies for many years have been able to pursue a policy so detrimental to the best interests of the public." So Americans, north and south, east and west, in the countryside and in the cities, are realizing that railroads are a symbol of progress. They're necessary for advancing the United States, but at what cost? Is this increasing inequality? Is this making a machine more valuable than men? Well, to combat managers and bosses, working class folks, blue collar workers, banded together, and they formed the first nationwide union in American history. Their full title was the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. Now, as their name indicates, they were a bit more than, say, a modern union of electrical workers or other things in today's time. This union also resembled the rituals, oaths, and regalia of fraternal organizations like the Freemasons. So this is part labor union and part kind of brotherhood like the Masons. So this is a pretty big transformation because before the Civil War, most labor unions in the U.S. functioned more like craft guilds. You were in a guild of a blacksmith or something, with very little cooperation between people of different jobs. The Knights of Labor changes that. It is founded, the Knights of Labor, in 1869, the year when the first transcontinental railroad is completed. The Knights of Labor grows very rapidly in the 1870s and 1880s as the industrialization of the United States creates such progress. It also creates a good bit of poverty as well. And those profits and wealth that railroads generate, many workers and farmers worry that it's not being evenly enjoyed. As one labor newspaper would say in 1874, which would ring true in 1886 according to many, quote, "Capital has now the same control over us that the aristocracy of England had at the time of the Revolution." So who are the members of this union? One is they phrase themselves and this labor conflict around the idea of being a producer. They use this phrase producer if you go back and look at their records. What we would equate that today is working with your hands, having a sweat of your brow, working with your hands. You make something through your own labor. You produce something. So farmers were producers. Workers were producers. They're doing something physically with their hands. Non-producers, these were individuals they defined as what we might see today as pencil pushers, right? Not necessarily a bad thing, but these non-producers were seen as what we see today as white-collar workers, but especially the owners and managers of railroads who reaped a lot of their profits, but workers don't think that they are producing things like they are. Well, the Knights of Labor was a big tent union, meaning it welcomed all wage earners as members. All wage earners could join. That included skilled and unskilled workers. Previously, labor unions tended to represent only skilled workers, like a steel union would represent those skilled steel workers, not the unskilled. Knights of Labor welcomes all workers, from the common bricklayer up into a trainman. Well, likewise, this is Big Ten in that it pretty remarkably was non-discriminatory when it came to race or gender. It welcomed African Americans, immigrants, women, people of different faiths, African Americans as well as white, women as well as men, immigrants as well as the American born joined the order. Well, if black Americans are welcome, women as well, which though would we guess what type of ethnic group might be excluded in the Knights of Labor? There's another group that faced a lot of hostility in the 19th century.
Chinese?
The Chinese, yes. Chinese Americans, whether they be American born or immigrants, the Chinese were barred from membership of the Knights of Labor. Well, the height of the Knights of Labor comes in 1886, this very strike we're about to look at, with over 700,000 dues-paying members and 15,000 local assemblies scattered throughout the country. Well, as we're about to see, there are some weaknesses to the Knights of Labor that Jay Gould is going to exploit. One is the strength of the Knights of Labor was also a drawback. Since it was so large and big tent, it meant local unions had a lot of independence. It was very decentralized, meaning those local assemblies, that local union, the Knights of Labor 101 or something, could start a strike or instigate something and kind of let that snowball without thinking it through. So some local groups could be more radical or more conservative. Each union had a lot of autonomy. Likewise, labor unions like the Knights of Labor suffered a lot from infiltration. Railroad owners would just hire a lackey to say, yeah, I'm a railroad worker, and spy on the organization. Or, as we'll see in this strike that we're about to discuss, maybe even be kind of plant a false flag, if you will. Start some agitation and make sure it is going in a direction that actually would benefit that railroad owner. So paid spies and double agents were pretty common. Likewise, railroad owners like Jay Gould made sure to still try to divide workers along skilled and unskilled lines. On railroads, your skilled workers were the railroad engineers, but also the firemen, the brakemen, the switchmen. Those were skilled railroad workers. And the railroad bosses tended to dole out favors and treat them a bit better, because of course the whole purpose of a strike is to stop production in that industry. If you're having a railroad strike, the trains aren't supposed to be moving. Well, if the skilled workers aren't on your side in that strike, they're going to keep the trains moving, and we'll see that. So what is mobilizing people working on the railroad in Texas to begin this strike in 1886? There are several grievances for the railroad workers. One was very frequent layoffs or being fired. You could lose your job at any moment for a whole host of reasons. And if that railroad fell on hard times, if maybe a bubble burst, the employers often would lay off a wide swath of workers at any moment. Likewise, while workers would agree to work for a certain wage, there was no guaranteeing that that pay would be steady. Pay cuts were very common in recessions, which back then they called panics. So pay cuts, often of about 20%, could come at any time. Meanwhile, workers were quick to point out that railroad officials, railroad managers, they didn't have pay cuts. Only the workers suffered those. That could reduce many to near poverty. Likewise, excessively long hours were very common. The average work week for railroad workers was around 60 hours a week, sometimes plus. So steel and railroad workers, which are leading forces of America's industrialization, those are some of the more hardest worked workers. And there's no one even used the phrase weekend in this period. An English journalist back in England in 1879 was the first to ever use the phrase weekend. Not until 1908 does a New England textile mill become the first factory to institute a 5-day week. We're talking about 7 days a week working on railroads or in steel mills. If we went back in time and said, what are you doing on the weekend? They'd say, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, not just long hours, but as often happens when you're working 12-hour shifts, the work can be very dangerous. Yearly industrial accident rates, so these were the industrial accident rates for workers as a whole, not just in the railroad industry. But yearly industrial accident rates, conservative estimates are about 25,000 killed and 1 million injured on the job every year. Every year. For railroad workers specifically, in the 1880s and 1890s, about 1,500 died each year and 19,000 were injured each year. Think about it this way. Industrial accidents in the United States during the Gilded Age produced greater casualties than Americans experienced in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, or the various wars against American Indians. Each year. Jeez. Put another way, men died working industrial jobs about as much as women died in childbirth. So railroads, a symbol of the new age, provided the most dangerous work as well. Well, why such high rates? American workers on the railroad were twice as likely to die on the job as railroad workers in Britain in the 1880s. And part of this was an unwillingness of employers to invest money in technologies and practices that would increase worker safety. Why? Because it would cut profits, and workers were plenty. So if you smash your hand trying to break a train, you were fired and they'd find somebody else rather than invest in expensive safety technologies. And danger occurred because one or two workers often had to do jobs that should have taken many more men to do safely. So the dangers of work rose in every industrializing country in the late 19th century, but they rose faster and higher in the U.S. than any other. So workers see a central problem of this around the idea of monopolies, what we might call special interest groups that greedily control economies with financial corruption against the more well-meaning populace. So what do the Knights of Labor want? We're setting up their goals before we dive into specifics. The Knights of Labor are a pretty forward-thinking organization. Take out the Chinese racism part that was very central. It was not a side issue. That was very motivating for them. Anyhow, the Knights of Labor wanted to end convict labor. That was a big thing, particularly in the South. End of convict labor. They likewise wanted to eliminate child labor. Both convict labor and child labor worked for pennies on the dollar, which undermined the wages of railroad workers. Knights, on paper, were led by men, but leading their time, they did advocate equal pay for women doing the same work as men. And just trying to get railroad employers to acknowledge the extent of injuries and deaths on the job meant that the Knights of Labor was struggling even to get state and federal government to monitor labor statistics, like deaths and injuries. So the Knights of Labor wants worker safety as well. There were technologies on railroads to adopt things like an automatic coupler on railroad cars, but they were a bit expensive, so many railroads didn't do it. But what motivated these Knights of Labor men and women, black and white, immigrant and native born, more than anything else, was something that's pretty common today. That is the idea of a 9-to-5 job, an 8-hour shift. They sought a reduction of those incessantly long work hours, 7 days a week, 60-plus hour work weeks. They wanted an 8-hour workday. They said, as their slogan, if you can see it here, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will, to divide out the 24 hours. They were nonpartisan. The Knights of Labor lobbied Republicans and Democrats. Their rhetoric and their lectures in newspapers, in strikes that we're about to look at, preached a pretty fiery mixture of the Declaration of Independence, biblical teachings, and blue-collar pride. And laborers are motivated pretty frequently by new government laws that brought civil and economic rights to former slaves. So in the years after the Civil War, many of these workers want to continue to evolve American democracy into a form that would include workers' rights, like the rights of former slaves. So the idea of the Knights of Labor is bound up in citizenship. They argue that as Americans, workers should be treated with dignity, and that to get better pay and only work 8 hours rather than a 12-hour shift would enable them to be better citizens. And they often saw how heavy-handed managerial practices, in their terms, threatened their independence and their masculinity. There's a lot of gendered rhetoric in these male railroad workers as well. Well, immigrants like August Spies from Germany and others would imbue this Knights of Labor with a European sense of class identity as well. Well, let's talk about this individual who owns the railroad of what we're discussing, and that is Jay Gould. Jay Gould. Jay Gould, pictured here at the bottom left, was born in New York in 1836, and Gould owned several technically distinct railroads in the South and the West that was called Gould's Southwest System. Gould would own 12% of all railroads in the country in the 1880s. And Gould was nefarious and had a pretty bad reputation in his own time for 3 reasons. One is, in 1869, he led an effort to corner the gold market. He became friends with President Ulysses S. Grant's brother-in-law to get insider information. Likewise, Tammany Hall controlled city patronage. They employed more than 12,000 people in New York City. But the leaders of Tammany forged an alliance with Jay Gould. Tammany controlled the judges of New York, and Gould made sure he was allied with Tammany so those judges could rule favorable injunctions and side with him on strikes. Gould would even bail out the boss of Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed, when he was in the slammer. So Gould rises to power through something that was meant as a pejorative term at the time, speculation. Speculation would be like kind of floating stocks and bonds, or buying a company and then breaking it up to kind of see some of those profits there. So Gould gains his wealth not by actually constructing and running railroads, but often floating railway shares and trying to buy low, sell high. Harper's Monthly described Gould as, quote, small, cadaverous, bearded, with sunken, glittering eyes. He hardly ever speaks. He was a recluse. Yet while you speak, he listens and looks at you with fierce and fascinating eyes. Well, other rivals of Gould were even less complimentary. Collis Huntington, California, described Gould as a vulture who lands, quote, upon one thing or another, sucks some portion of its lifeblood, then takes flight again for some other carcass. Gould's rival, Cornelius Vanderbilt, told a journalist, quote, I consider Mr. J. Gould a damn villain. You can't put it too strongly. So if there was a James Bond villain of the Gilded Age, J. Gould would be it. Well, here's Gould's Southwest system, centered around St. Louis and stretching to the west and into the south. We're going to be talking about the strike beginning in Marshall, Texas. Well, in 1885, it appeared that the Knights of Labor had won a victory over Jay Gould. In 1885, Gould had agreed to not discriminate against Knights of Labor members and to rehire those who had been fired for being the Knights of Labor. And in return, the Knights of Labor said they would not strike without first conferring with Gould. Well, this had some pretty significant shortcomings because nothing was enforcing Gould to stick to his word. So on March 6, 1886, Charles Hall, a worker on Gould's Texas and Pacific Railroad, attended a union meeting in Marshall, Texas, and was summarily fired. Well, records indicate that Gould likely had some paid informants at that local assembly, and he wanted to instigate a strike to then turn around and tell the Knights of Labor that they weren't carrying on their end of the bargain. Remember in 1885, a year before, the Knights of Labor agreed they wouldn't strike without first consulting Gould. Well, Gould had some inside men, ensured the strike came out before Gould was consulted. Well, within 2 days, in March of 1886, nearly 2,000 men had stopped working all along Gould's rail network, especially in Missouri and Texas. One St. Louis newspaper said that traffic was throbbing. The Gould system was at the mercy of the Knights of Labor. Well, the American public sided with the Knights of Labor in many ways during this strike. Farmers also had a beef with the railroad for its high prices that they often charged. So the Farmers Alliance was a group of farmers who banded together to try to mobilize for better rates and to bring about legislation to better regulate the railroad industry. So the Farmers Alliance begins in Texas, and at the time of the Great Railroad Strike, they had over 100,000 members in Texas. Well, during the railroad strike of 1886 we're talking about, the Knights of Labor and the Farmers Alliance united in many ways to struggle against what both saw as control of the country by large monopolies. So the Farmers Alliance donated money in Texas for food for strikers and money for their families. At one Farmers Alliance meeting, they made a resolution in Texas that we, quote, sympathize deeply in the misfortune of the Knights of Labor in their struggle to feed and clothe their families, and ask them to meet us, the Knights of Labor, at the ballot box and help overthrow all monopolies. So in the midst of the strike, a combined parade of 10,000 farmers and laborers marched through Dallas in March of 1886. Well, there were three things that ultimately would end this strike and give Jay Gould a victory. Gould does three things to ensure this strike fails. One was that it was ill-timed and unorganized. Remember, the Knights of Labor is really decentralized, which contributed to its boom in membership, but they're not able to organize this strike very well. So the leader of the Knights of Labor actually learned about the strike in the newspaper the next day. So not a good thing. Likewise, Gould successfully won over skilled railroad workers, those engineers and firemen and brakemen and switchmen that were necessary to running a train. Well, when strikers' ability to halt railroads was limited, that really defeated the whole purpose of the strike. The purpose of the strike is to halt production. Having skilled workers with Jay Gould meant that the strike was difficult to continue. The third and decisive way that Gould wins in the Southwest Railroad strike of 1886 is through the very technical historical term of legal shenanigans. Legal shenanigans. Gould intentionally, behind scenes, this is the height of the smoke-filled back rooms and all types of political chicanery going on. Gould intentionally declared one part of his railroad, the Texas and Pacific, where the strike began. Gould intentionally declared the Texas and Pacific to be bankrupt. Well, what happened when a railroad goes bankrupt? It's temporarily operated by the government because the railroad can't just not function. And the government operates that railroad via men appointed by the courts. And remember, Jay Gould controls those courts. So the legal term at the time was known as receivership. So Jay Gould bribed a lot of these judges, and the court appointed one of Gould's lackeys, who was actually an ex-governor of Texas, John C. Brown. Well, making the Texas and Pacific Railroad run by the government now meant that that was government property, and that those railroad officers and workers were federal workers. So when the strikers go to combat the railroad, now they're combating Uncle Sam, since the railroad now is government property through Gould's backdoor dealings. So a strike against the Texas and Pacific now means you're interfering with the federal government and its property and its laws. Well, strikers didn't back down. Strikers did not back down. Since the strike's ability to halt railroads was limited, they would destroy over 400 engines on Gould's line. And that would lead some public sentiment to turn against the Knights of Labor, since it was disrupting the trade and commerce of the country. But strikers battled it out in street warfare with Pinkerton agents and deputized men aligned with Gould in pitched battles in Fort Worth and in St. Louis. Well, by April 1st of 1886, Gould, by declaring the Texas and Pacific bankrupt and therefore operated by the government, the courts issued injunctions and declared the strike illegal and used federal officials to turn that down. So the strike ends by April of 1886, but let's look at some significant legacies as we conclude. So the strike ends. It is a big blow to the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor would have their peak in 1886, but also their decline in 1886. The Knights of Labor would never recover from this defeat on the part of Jay Gould. Basically, other workers lost faith in the Knights of Labor since they weren't able to carry out the strike. So the Knights of Labor would dissipate rapidly after 1886. New organizations would come in their wake, the American Federation of Labor, for example. Well, what began in Texas, and even though that railroad strike ended by April of 1886, it continued like wildfire in Chicago. And the strike in Chicago led to one of the more pivotal moments of the Guild Age, known as the Haymarket Affair. That was fascinating to be a talk in its own right. Well, kind of as a throwing a bone to labor, the unrest of 1886 is led to the creation of Labor Day. So May 1st was the date that Chicago Knights of Labor folks agitated, and May 1st would become International Labor Day, even though the U.S. we do it in September. Well, despite the Knights of Labor being defeated, public outcry to better oversee railroads did reach a tipping point. In 1887, a result of the Great Southwest Railroad strike in 1886 was that a year later, the Interstate Commerce Act is passed. This is the first major piece of business regulation in U.S. history. It said that the railroads must charge reasonable and just rates. Tried to do away with that extortion. But if you're a railroad and you're a monopoly, you charge whatever you want. The Interstate Commerce Act said they cannot do that. Likewise, the Interstate Commerce Act said that companies could no longer conspire to fix rates or eliminate competition. So every now and then, even in today's time, you might hear news of investigations of airline companies maybe secretly getting together to set airline rates. Same thing for what railroads sometimes would try to do. So the Great Southwest Railroad strike of 1886 is the height of the first ever labor union in the United States. It starts here in Texas, in Marshall, Texas. It demonstrates, it really is a case study in a nutshell of a lot of the phenomena that were going on in the Gilded Age. That was galvanized in the country by the time the railroad is extended here into San Angelo in 1888 with the Santa Fe Railroad. So hopefully you've gained a bit more of an understanding of what was going on in the United States, widely, particularly with railroads, right at the time that the railroad would extend into this local area we have today. Thank you for bearing with me, and thank you for listening. We'll now have time for questions. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Did Gould get his railroad back out of receivership?
Yes, yeah. So Gould was able to get that back. In fact, yeah. Gould will die in 1889 of tuberculosis. I think he's relatively young, in his 50s or so. But yeah, Gould dies in 1889. Gould's passing would lead other men to kind of fill that void, but particularly J.P. Morgan would be even more prominent after the death of Gould. Yeah, other questions?
Is there a good movie about this? It must be a movie.
I know, yeah, you would think so, but not that I'm aware of. There's a few documentaries, you know, PBS and whatnot, that would make it fascinating. I'm not aware of. I've yet to watch the Yellowstone spinoff, 1883, but I'm hoping they talk a little bit about railroads in this decade at least. Yeah, another question.
What happened to the Chinese laborers that actually built the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad? Were
Yeah.
they civil aid, or were they ejected from the country, or what happened?
So the first Transcontinental Railroad constructed in the mid-1860s, completed in 1869, that did rely a lot on Chinese workers, you're right. Railroad construction in Texas and through much of the East, Midwest, and South didn't use much Chinese workers, but on that first Transcontinental they did. And you really have systematic expulsion of them as workers. There's a lot of other Americans and immigrants, other immigrants, kind of banded together against the Chinese. So after that railroad was completed, many Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans are kind of pushed forcibly into Chinatowns, into even more further segregation, but also a lot of violence. Some of them are expelled with the Tacoma massacres, various other aspects. So they are able to use some. They go on strike actually too. Chinese workers in that Transcontinental Railroad. They're getting pretty good pay for what they could have gotten back home. So many of them send that back home as well. Sort of male workers supporting things. Other questions?
There's a program on TV, I think it's on Netflix, called The Gilded Age.
Yes, yes.
It's about the railroads in New York.
That's right, yes. Yeah, I watched that show actually. I haven't quite finished the season.
Yeah.
It's enjoyable, yeah.
It's very enjoyable.
Yeah. One kind of criticism I have of it is, it's one of those deals maybe where the show's not trying to do this, so it may be an unjust criticism. But New York's very clean in the show. I want a little more grime and dirt. And I wish they could work in a bit more, since it's about this railroad guy, fictitiously, more about his workers and some of those conflicts
Right.
It'd be neat if maybe season 2, he has to confront the striking workers or something.
Right.
So I imagine that show goes on. They'll mention 9 years later, and now you know what it is.
Yeah.
So that show said in 1884, so they'll be getting these years.
How long was this rental here?
This building was built in 1920.
And what's that?
1910.
This was 1910, yeah. So the railroad comes here in 1888, you get a stop at the current building, and it becomes the headquarters, regional headquarters of the railroad here.
How many other railroad companies are there?
Well, so you have one thing that sets the progressive era, the early 20th century, apart from the Gilded Age, is in the Gilded Age you have a mad rush of railroad companies. Think about, say, the dot-com boom, where anybody was investing in internet companies, and people were creating companies out of their garages. Some went on like gangbusters, but a lot of them just collapsed, right? In the 1870s and 1880s, you had a ton of railroad companies being formed. Some never even laid a mile of track, except they're floating stocks, they're getting investors and kind of swindling folks in a lot of ways. So the 1870s and 1880s, there were an innumerable amount of railroad companies on paper. But the big players would be the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York and Erie Canal Railroad was a big one. That's Vanderbilt's Railroad. And all railroads would go to Chicago. That's a good question.
Who's the game monopoly based on this?
That's a great question. I mentioned that. And when you're playing Monopoly, you are playing a Gilded Age game. You're either wearing a top hat and have a cane like a robber baron. What are you trying to do? Own all the property and kick everybody out, right? Monopoly is not a game about partnerships and the like. You're trying to own the Pennsylvania Railroad, own the utilities companies, own the land, and kick everybody out. Yeah. So I don't know when Monopoly was invented with Hasbro, whoever the company is, but it's very much a Gilded Age game for sure. Yeah. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I can recommend some books by historians if you want to chat after it's all.
We want to thank you guys for coming to the first lecture series of the year. We will have one in September, so keep that in mind. You can follow us on social media. We will have information about that. We'll give Dr. Powers a round of applause for his. Also, we do have refreshments here. Feel free to grab some on your way out. And like I said, if you're interested in supporting us and in honor of the 25th anniversary, we do have the things available for sale, and Susie is at the registry ready to take your. So thank you for coming. We appreciate it, and we hope that you have a good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Similar style.
I know.
I don't think I said likewise.
You said it 3 times. Oh, sure, absolutely.
Well, so the art classes, you're going to get the highlights also. You're talking about reading this, right?
Well, yeah, you thought you said 3 times, and then you said 4. I was like, are you fine about it?
No, thank you.